Hello everyone and welcome to Warhammer Workshop. It looked rare like I was going to be working on a Neurolictor, but as you can very quickly see, I changed my mind. Now don't worry, if you are like me and you're a Neurolictor fan, that little bugger makes a few appearances in this video. Now I decided to go for the big guy. I painted the Neurolictor in parallel with him, but I wanted to demonstrate the big guy because he's got a couple of assembly peculiarities, and he's a very good model to demonstrate some of the paint techniques that I use for my particular color scheme. Now, as you can see, this is kind of your classic big monster. There is one thing that is interesting about him. There are two configurations. You've got the Norn Emissary and the Norn Assimilator, and they're both essentially the same body, except there is this one piece where the main body and the legs connect that looks like you've got two different options, and it's my belief that these are just slightly different positionings, and I don't think that you're married to either one or the other depending on the configuration you want. So if you're going to have two Norn Emissaries and you want them to be a little bit different without having to do any crazy conversions, then you can easily just switch out that little middle part that I'm going to point out when we see it, but that little part where that connects the upper body, the torso to the legs, switch that up. It'll change its position a little bit, and you can have a bit of fun with that. All in all, he's a very easy model to assemble, like all Tyranid large models are. There's no real particularities to point out except for the tail. There is one piece of assembly in the tail that you'll notice. As you see, I'm working on it. The tail is in kind of three parts, where you've got a left side, a right side, and then you've got the rest of the tail towards the end. At the end, there's a bit of a rattler. There's two options, one for the emissary, one for the assimilator. Doesn't really matter. That doesn't have an impact. What has an impact is how those two left and right pieces assemble. It leaves you with a very pronounced demarcation between the two pieces. You've got a gap that you need to deal with, and since this is an extremely smooth piece, usually Games Workshop recently have been doing an extremely good job at managing, always having an overlapping piece, something like there's going to be a bit of chitin, something that's going to hide those seams. On this part, you have nothing. It is completely naked, and it is a little bit hard to remove, so be aware of that going in. If you were to look very closely at my model once finished, you could probably spot just a tiny little bit where I wasn't able to file it off completely smooth, and I think that's going to bother me until I build a second one of these models, which is not impossible, mind you. It is a very cool model. It builds very fast for its size. Regarding the size, by the way, this isn't a knight. Don't expect this to be knight size. This is more comparable to a greater demon. And if you look at the stats on it, it is very much in the same vein. I'm not saying it fulfills the same battlefield role as a greater demon, but it's about the same size, about the same importance, and about the same footprint. And you can see me rushing and trying to get rid of those mold lines right here, those assembly lines on the tail, and it's a nightmare. I think I go back to it later after this part of the assembly that you're going to see in the video. I go back and I try to use some putty and some other things. Anyways, it's I wouldn't say it's a delight to assemble. There are some pieces that are annoying, and we'll get back to it in the final assembly, but generally it's not too big of a deal. Now, this is something that I've been asked a few times, is the recipe for how I airbrush my Tyranids and how I paint them in general. So we're going to go through the entire painting process fast. Now here you see that I've got the upper body and the lower body assembled. Don't do that. I did some sub-assemblies. Mostly what I did is legs, upper body with the smaller lower arms. The two upper arms are separate, and I kept the head separate, and that's very important. Now I start here with a bit of an undercoat for the skin of Caliban Green. Just airbrush it roughly liberally. You're trying to use this mostly so that you're not painting directly on black. It's not the most complicated color scheme, you'll notice, and it's also a very old color scheme. I've been painting this color scheme for maybe 20 to 25 years. This is how I was painting Tyranids way back in the day. So just apply the Caliban Green relatively liberally, only on the areas with the skin. Don't worry about overstepping and overflowing. You're going to be painting the carapace separately. Now, the Sotek Green is where it gets kind of interesting. What I just did here, like painting on my hand, don't do that. It's probably not good for your health. I'm an idiot, and I don't take care of myself very well, so don't use me as an example. But as you can see, I'm hitting the model mostly in a very light fashion, exclusively from the side. Not too much from the top, and definitely not from the bottom, because I want to keep some of that Caliban green in the shadows. Now here's the tricky part. This is any kind of bone that you'll be using, and you can use any kind of beige. An off-white will work perfectly for this. Even a pure white will work. What I'm doing is fully a top spraying, paying special attention to anything that's going to receive a lot of light, like the top of the tail. You'll notice, and that's why I picked that particular piece, so that I could show this off very well. The head is not a good example for this, but you'll notice that I'm hitting it mostly for the top, paying attention to any bulge in the muscles, anything that's going to catch light. And right now it looks stark. It looks like it's way too much of a color contrast. It's too pale. But the next step is where sort of magic. If you're familiar with how airbrushes work and how layering colors with an airbrush works, you'll see what I mean. And now here's a better example that you can see with the muscles on the arm to show off really where, you know, I pick off like these areas of stark light. If you've got a good airbrush, these steps are very easy. These are shortcuts. Now, Ogren Camo is where the quote-unquote magic happens. So from a slight angle, not completely from the top, you hit the model very lightly, kind of the same way that we did with the Sotek Green, but you're trying to overlay your color over the pale, the ivory or off-white that you did. And what it does is that it layers itself on top of the off-white, colors it, and maintains those shadows. This is where I'm not very clever in how I paint. Like, I shouldn't be holding the models directly. If you were clever, you'll be putting pins under the feet. Just, I was in a hurry in finishing those models, so there's a lot of things that I kind of took shortcuts. But as you can see, like, the starkness of it kind of vanishes the moment you start applying this Ogren Camo. Meaning that, like, now your skin is really looking the green that it's supposed to be looking, but it's got like the shadows, it's got this initial highlight, and these steps are super fast to do. And if you're doing a large model like a Norn Emissary, Harrispex, anything of that volume, you want to have, like, you want to shorten those steps if you want to get to the tabletop. Now, going back with Ogren Camo, the light airbrush didn't do justice to the highlight, so you want to go back in. And I apologize, my thumb is going to be in the way a lot. I'm still getting used to filming while I'm painting. But you want to go back with that Ogren Camo, pure color, diluted to the texture of like 3% or 2% milk, and just apply highlights, very liberal highlights. You're just trying to get all these pieces to stand out as much as possible. Again, you're trying to get the shadows and highlights to really be pronounced. One of the things that I keep telling friends when they're getting into painting miniature figs is that you want to have a lot of contrast, because unless you're trying to go for something that's going to be looked at very closely, like a Golden Demon entry, you want that contrast in the same way that theater performers want very pronounced makeup. And that is so that it is the difference, the contrast, and the details are visible from a distance. And on the tabletop, your distance is basically, if you're looking at your fig from 2 to 3 feet away, you want those details. You want this to look good, attract the eye, and have people want to take that closer look. You just want it to look good on the battlefield. So this is where it gets a little bit more time consuming. I think this is of the model, this is the most time consuming steps, because Tyranids are very textured, but they're also precisely textured. I've done this step as a dry brush on other models. And it works very well, especially if you use like a sort of a wet dry brush in the same way that, say, the guys at what are they called, Artis Opus kind of teach us to do. You can check their videos for that. Then this is a mix of pure white and Ogren Camo, just to get these slight highlights even a little bit more stark. This is just like your finishing touches. This goes by a lot faster, but it makes it pop even more, really giving, you know, that skinned texture that you want to have, so that all those ridges, all that ribbing really stands out and looks good. Now, obviously, I'm concentrating only on the skin for this, and I'm going to go back to the skin with some washes for certain areas, but you'll notice that mostly in the finished model. It is mostly to differentiate certain parts, give it more of a fleshy look. But I don't go through that technique in detail. They're just washes. But if at some point any of you want me to go into those details, just ask in the comments, and I'll make a video about it. This is not bad for the amount of time I put on it. And now we go with the carapace. The carapace I paint in Sotek Green, which used to be Hawk Turquoise. Exactly the same color. It's just obviously the Games Workshop has been doing a lot of rebranding of their colors in the years so that they have their own names on their own colors. The fun thing about this color, it's a layer, but it applies like a base in the sense that you can do the two thin coats, and it works very well. You'll notice it as I'm painting right now. It's just like there's a bit of transparency. The black comes out a bit, but once that's dry, I go back for a second coat, and it covers it wonderfully. For a layer, it's got an odd amount of pigment count, and does a very good job of just painting directly over black, no problem. I wish yellows had always been like that. That's one thing. If you listen to this channel, you'll notice that I often go back to turquoise, not just because it's one of my favorite colors, but also the paints for turquoise tend to be very good no matter what paint line you go for. Now you'll notice that little horn there is still has a lot of black streaks, and the moment you put on that second coat, it just covers it completely. Now, mind you, you don't mind leaving a little bit of darkness in any of the recesses or under the ridges, because you're going to be going back to that with some highlights and some shading that's going to hide any imperfection. So I would recommend going for probably a slightly lighter tone, so that you know, not a lighter tone, but a lighter touch. Like, it's not a problem if you have some splotchiness to it, rather than having like really thick paint. You don't want to have thick paint, because then you'll lose some details and it'll look weird. Now what I did here is I mixed one part of the Sotek Green with one part black, so I could add some shading to it. And this is especially interesting and important for Tyranid pieces, because you want to do that little striation, those little lines that I'm doing right now. I'm sorry, like the autofocus isn't great, but this is what gives the armor and the chitin on Tyranids that texture that makes them look so cool. So you want to be able to go and do that specific sort of those shading by hand. You can't really rely on just putting a little bit of some null oil under there. Now, to be honest, I do go back and I do add some null oil in some of the cracks when I really want them to be super dark, just to emphasize that. But that's on top, and just as a sort of a course correction to what I'm doing right now with the striation and just picking out those colors. Then I go for this is not a 50-50 mix. It's more of a maybe 75-25 mix of Sotek Green pure white. And this is where I start picking out the edges and details to make the chitin pop. Now the trick is, mostly you'll notice that I use a lot the side of my brush whenever I'm hitting those edges. That's to avoid using the point, which would not necessarily hit the edge the way I want it. And also immediately you'll notice right now what I'm doing is I'm doing the same style of lines and striation as I did with the shading, but this time with the highlighting. So these two sort of lines, the dark ones and the light ones, kind of meet each other to create this very rich texture of lining. And I do this once with this highlight, and I do it again with another highlight, just to make it really, really stand out. It's especially important on large figs, so that it looks like you actually put in some work on the armor and chitin and striations, so that it looks very textured. Later on, there are some details like teeth and the interior of the mouth. I don't necessarily show how I paint those. They're fairly standard. There's plenty of guides on how to paint teeth and bone. I don't think you should have any problem doing that. And if you do, you have any questions, again, any video that you want me to do, I can't promise I'll do it overnight, but if you comment that you want to see something in particular, I'll be glad to try to put something together at some point. This is also where you can get a little bit creative. You'll notice on top of the horn, there's kind of like this curve to it on which I put a little bit more highlight to kind of give it a bit more of a shine. I didn't want to go too hard on it because then it would look like non-metallic metallics, and that's a little bit too cartoony for what I'm going for. And also I don't want this to look like metals, but I did want to use that kind of that part of the texture to just give it something a little bit more a bit more refined, like really not necessarily show off, but go a bit harder. Then the last highlight is with Barrow Blue. If this were a more like, this is still a centerpiece model, but if I really wanted to put more effort into it, I could have done a Barrow Blue and white final highlight, just to pick out certain, like the tips of certain pieces of carapace, like the points of it. There's some very, very fine lines. That's a level of effort that is cool, and I tend to do it for centerpiece model, but again, I was a bit pressed for time on this one. Like whenever we get something from Games Workshop, whenever they're generous enough to send us models, I always want to have something to show by the time the model releases, and that obviously puts a time constraint on it. But you can already see like the addition of that white, contrasting with the shading in the black that I put, it really gives dimension to the model. Where everything was flat and you couldn't necessarily see all the detail of that armor, of that chitin. It is a cool detail. This is much more detailed than some of the smaller models. So you want to be able to pick that out and have it stand out. And it is worth putting in the effort. Now, by the time I got to this point, I was really looking forward to assembling everything, but I had to hold off. So the last part of the model is getting the glowing brain effect. Now, this is a very easy trick that I'm using here. It is a shortcut, but it is a shortcut that, a little bit like Slapchop as a method, is something that you can go back without redoing and just add more to it. Right now, I'm missing certain products. I want to try to add some of the white oil to get certain parts to pop off in a glowing effect, but I don't have that product yet. So what I'm doing is I'm painting every part that I want to glow the starkest white possible. Since I'm airbrushing, obviously I'm going to go do many many coats of it, so that I don't want my paint to be too wet and to do like do the spider web thing. As you're doing this, you want to go over the area that you're painting. You want to have that overbrushing, overspraying outside of the edges. You want to color outside the lines a little bit. Like as you can see here on the top of the head, it gives it more of a glow effect. And once you put in the color, which in this case it's Talisar Blue, it's a contrast paint which has a lot of pigment. It's very saturated, very bright color. You have to be careful painting it because it's more liquidy, but as you can see, it gives it a very bright look. And if you keep some of the white, I'm sorry, my framing is not great, but if you keep some of the white around, like in the middle of the piece that's glowing, it really gives it that bright glowing effect, that very, very stark OSL. And as I said, this is a shortcut. It's not a final product, but it does the job very well for a basic tabletop look. Now you can see this is how it came out on the head, and it looks pretty badass. Now remember when I told you not to glue the head or the torso and the legs? As you can see in the instruction, they tell you glue the legs to the torso and then glue the head. But that would be a mistake, and I'll show you why. Now, as you can see, the head isn't very easy to properly position. However, if you haven't glued your torso to your legs yet, you can peer under the model and get a good idea of where things should be aligning. which isn't something that you can do from the top, because from the top, like the entire head, everything kind of masks where things are going to be glued. Now, I recommend using a relatively generous amount of glue on both parts. Use plastic glue. I mean, I know a lot of people use, they use cyanoacrylate or super glue. Not my favorite method when doing big pieces like that, because you really want that plastic to melt into the plastic to get that proper type of adherence. Now, I do it on both parts because I want to make sure that I have as many contact points as possible. One of the things that you notice when you try to assemble the head is that it's not as perfect a fit as what we're used to seeing with those 3D sculpted models from Games Workshop these days. Now, as you can see, like getting that particular angle properly is a little bit difficult, but if you flip the model over, you can get the proper alignment to make sure that everything is going to be aligned properly and glue exactly as it should. Once that's done, all you need to do is again put a little bit of glue on the model's torso and on the leg portion so that it assembles properly. This one again is a little bit tricky to assemble because you've got that little notch up front where I put that little dot of glue there, and you kind of need to snap it in and then pull the model back up so that it gets the proper position. So once the little nub is in the proper insert point, you can move the model back in and it'll just settle into the proper position and it'll be perfect.
Materials shown in this video are provided fully or in part by Games Workshop for promotional purposes. If you enjoyed this video, please consider dropping us a like and subscribing. Thanks for watching.